June 2012, Queen's Club, London. The final, one of the most prestigious grass tournaments on earth. The dress rehearsal for Wimbledon. The crowd is in their linen jackets and summer hats. Everything is as it should be, civilized, British. And then a man snaps. Not in the way that athletes snap, swearing under their breath, smashing a racket. No. David Nalbandian launches a kick at an advertising board so savage that the wood shatters, and a chunk of it drives into the shin of a line judge named Andrew McDougall. The man drops. There is blood on the grass. The stadium goes silent, and then it erupts, not in applause, but in the kind of collective disbelief that you only get when a man reveals in front of millions exactly who he is. He was defaulted immediately. He lost all his points, all his prize money. Scotland Yard opened a criminal investigation for assault, and David Nalbandian walked off that court with the look of a man who had done this before. Not on a tennis court, but in locker rooms, in boardrooms, in private apartments. On the phone with teammates, he was robbing blind. Because here's what no one told you about Nalbandian. The kick was the only honest thing he ever did in public. To understand what broke in London that afternoon, you have to go back, way back, to a cement court in Unquillo, a small town in the Cordoba hills of Argentina. A man named George Nalbandian had survived the Armenian genocide, had walked across mountains with nothing, and rebuilt his life, brick by brick, in South America. He built a house, he built a family, and in the backyard, he built a rough concrete tennis court for the grandchildren. In Argentina, concrete courts were considered barbaric. Argentina was the land of clay, red clay, soft clay, the surface that rewards patience and sliding footwork. But young David grew up hitting against a wall that never gave an inch. Hard surface, fast bounce. You had to meet the ball early or it would destroy you. That is where the backhand was born. Not in an academy, not under the guidance of a federation coach, on a concrete slab in the mountains built by a man who survived genocide. Analysts would later call Nalbandian's two-handed backhand the finest in the history of the sport. A shot of such mechanical perfection, such devastating precision that it stopped being a defensive stroke and became a weapon, a surgical instrument for controlled demolition. But the court also built something else in him, something harder to quantify. You see, cement doesn't forgive. Clay absorbs your mistakes. Cement exposes them. Every imperfection in your swing comes back at you faster, louder, angrier. And the boy who grew up on that court learned early, never give ground, never soften, never adapt to the surface, make the surface adapt to you. He carried that mentality onto the professional circuit, and it made him extraordinary, and it made him monstrous, often at the same time. By 17, the tennis world was already whispering his name. He arrived at Wimbledon Junior Tournament in 1999 and was disqualified before hitting a single ball. He missed his semi-final match because he was late. He claimed the organizers had changed the schedule without telling him. Maybe they had, maybe they hadn't. What's certain is that the story follows a pattern that would become very familiar. David Nalbandian, late. David Nalbandian, unapologetic. His nickname in the junior circuit. They called him the kid from the cement. And the way he played, the way he read opponents, the way he saw the geometry of the court before the point even started, it was already something frightening. He was reading Roger Federer's serve, he said, like it was written in giant letters. The early years of Nalbandian's professional career were a statement, not of potential, of fact. He beat Roger Federer 5 consecutive times in their first 5 professional meetings, 5 straight. Before Nadal, before Djokovic, before anyone had figured out how to reliably beat the Swiss machine, there was David Nalbandian quietly dismantling him match after match. In 2002, he reached the Wimbledon final. 20 years old. He lost to Leighton Hewitt, but the tennis world filed him under the same category as Federer, generational talent. The next king. Except there was something. A small voice in the press that kept getting louder, about his weight, about his conditioning, about the permanent softness around his midsection that no amount of talent could aesthetically disguise. They called him Fat Dave, not behind his back, to his face, in headlines, Fat Dave. And if you think that didn't land, that it didn't find a way under the armor of an incredibly proud Argentine man, you're wrong. It landed. It festered. But instead of fueling discipline the way it does for most elite athletes, it seemed to fuel something else in Nalbandian. A kind of furious defiance, a refusal to let the circuit standards define what he was. He wouldn't become a monk for anyone. And then came November 2005. Shanghai. Nalbandian wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't ranked high enough to qualify for the Masters Cup. He was in Patagonia, actually fishing, literally sitting on a riverbank in the south of Argentina, holding a rod, watching the water, when the phone rang. Andy Roddick had pulled out injured. Could he come? He swapped the fishing rod for a racket, boarded a flight to China, and walked into the most loaded draw in tennis. Roger Federer was waiting. The Swiss had won 35 matches in a row. He had won 24 consecutive finals. His season record stood at 81 wins and just 3 losses. He was so dominant that the tennis commentariat had essentially stopped calling matches and started writing history. Nalbandian dropped the first 2 sets. Most men concede at that point, not psychologically, physically. The body starts protecting itself from further embarrassment. The shoulders drop, the footing gets cautious, the shots get conservative. Nalbandian got sharper. He worked Federer with backhand slices so precise they looked like geometry homework. He dragged the Swiss to the net, to the place where Federer's then weakened ankle couldn't absorb the punishment. He played a second tie-break that lasted 11 points beyond deuce. He lost it, he didn't flinch, he won the match 6-7, 6-7, 6-2, 6-1, 7-6. He became the first Argentine to win the Masters since Guillermo Vilas in 1974. He denied Federer the chance to equal John McEnroe's all-time season record. And he did it as a last-minute substitute, fresh off a fishing trip. The world celebrated the genius. No one asked about the fault lines yet. They were there, invisible, widening, but the lights were too bright to see them. November 2007, Madrid. This is the week that still makes tennis historians stop mid-sentence and choose their words carefully. Because what David Nalbandian did across 7 days in Madrid is statistically one of the most difficult things any player has ever done. He beat Rafael Nadal, world number 2, the king of clay, in the quarterfinals. He beat Novak Djokovic, world number 3, in the semi-finals. He beat Roger Federer, world number 1, in the final. In 1 week, the same week, all 3, the entire trinity of modern tennis dismantled in sequence. The ranking algorithm placed that title's difficulty at 1.92, nearly double the average Masters 1000 score. It remains one of the 3 hardest paths to a trophy in the history of the series. Nalbandian described it afterward in terms that border on the mystical. He said the balls were coming in slow motion, that he could see every shot 2 beats before his opponents hit it, that he had time to spare against the best players on the planet, a sensation he would spend the rest of his career trying to recreate and never quite reaching again. That week should have been the beginning of something. Instead, it was the summit. Because here's the thing about genius without discipline. It can't sustain itself. Madrid was a week of grace, a perfect alignment of talent, luck, and timing. But the ATP Tour runs 52 weeks a year, and David Nalbandian was not built for 52 weeks of anything. The conditioning grind, the diet, the monastic routine that turned Djokovic and Murray into machines. He wouldn't bow to any of it, so the gaps between his great weeks were filled with something else, something that had been growing quietly since Unquillo. He found another court to rule, one where the opponents couldn't fight back, one that was entirely his, the Davis Cup, Argentina's religion, Nalbandian's empire. His record of 39 wins and 11 losses places him second only to Guillermo Vilas in Argentina history. He won 16 doubles ties, a national record that still stands. When the red and blue kit went on, something changed in him. The jersey brought out the best tennis of his career, and then the locker room door closed. By 2007, sources close to the Argentine squad described Nalbandian as the true power behind the team, not the man wearing the coaching badge, but the man no one dared contradict. Convocations, match orders, and crucially, money. In 2008, Argentina was preparing for the Davis Cup final against Spain. Nalbandian lobbied to have the final hosted in Córdoba, his home region. He told teammates the sponsorship arrangement would mean $500,000 for each player. According to multiple reports, what he did not disclose was that his own separate arrangement with the sponsors totaled $3 million more, on top of what everyone else received. His teammates found out, the trust didn't recover, and there was the young man from Tandil, when Juan Martín del Potro, 20 years old, just beginning a career that would one day shake the tennis world, joined the Davis Cup squad. The welcome he received reportedly bore no resemblance to what that word means. Sources inside the team described the dynamic as sustained and deliberate. Del Potro was new. Del Potro was talented. And in Nalbandian's Argentina, that combination had a cost, because in his world there was only one star, and that star did not share the sky. In 2010, Argentina traveled to Lyon to face France. They were losing 0-5, dead in the water. Nalbandian, according to reports, publicly overruled the captain's decisions, contradicted team strategy, and then, while the ties were still being played, left. He packed his bags and abandoned Lyon entirely. Captain Modesto Vázquez was left behind, publicly humiliated. Players finished the series without their so-called leader. The Argentine press called him out. The federation called it a crisis. Nalbandian said nothing, and the Roland Garros committee had already said everything that needed saying. Back in 2004, they awarded him the Premio Limão, the Lemon Prize, given to the player judged to have the worst character on the circuit. Not the worst game, not the worst performance, the worst character. He was 22 years old. By 2012, the fissures were everywhere. The body that had never quite matched the talent, the body he had refused to discipline, refused to treat with the monastic obsession of his rivals, was sending him a bill he could no longer defer. But first, June 2012, Queen's Club. You know what happened. The kick, the blood, Scotland Yard, the stripping of all points. What you might not know is what happened at the Australian Open the same year, a few months earlier. Nalbandian was undergoing an anti-doping test when, according to officials, he threw water at an ATP employee. Then he turned to the chair umpire and told him, in front of witnesses, that he was incapable of officiating Grand Slams. 2 separate incidents, 12 months apart, 2 separate investigations, 1 very consistent portrait. And here is where you have to stop, because this moment matters. Every man watching this has known someone like David Nalbandian. Maybe it was a boss, maybe it was a colleague, maybe, and this is the hardest version, maybe it was the man in the mirror, 30 years younger, when success felt like a license and talent felt like an exemption. You know that feeling. That specific arrogance that comes when you're genuinely good at something and the world keeps letting it slide. Every time someone forgives you, because you're useful, because you're brilliant, because losing you hurts more than tolerating you, the line moves. And you never notice the line moving. Until one afternoon in London, you kick a man's shin and the whole world sees it. That is the real tragedy of David Nalbandian. Not the Grand Slams he didn't win, not the #1 ranking he never held. The tragedy is that he had enough rope, and he used every inch of it. Late 2012. The body stopped negotiating. His right shoulder, specifically a slap tear, had been deteriorating for years. His hip labrum had ruptured. To attempt a return for the Davis Cup, he underwent a 6-hour surgery that addressed both injuries simultaneously. 6 hours on the table, he came back and tried to serve. The shoulder responded at 40% of its former capacity. 40%. For a player whose serve was already considered the weakest technical element of his game, already criticized as terrible for a player of his caliber, 40% wasn't a tennis career, it was an elegy. He retired in 2013, he was 31 years old. In the years that followed, he became a rally driver. Because of course he did, because Nalbandian, who had once done a bungee jump from 152 meters off the Danube Tower in Vienna the night before a tournament match, who had gone swimming with great white sharks at the Australian Open, was not built for stillness. He entered the Argentine Rally Championship, he crashed, he kept going, he entered again, he crashed again. He kept going. It took him 53 attempts. In 2019, on his 53rd entry, he finally won a rally stage, 53 times. And here is the contradiction that defines him. The man who couldn't be bothered to train hard enough to win a Grand Slam, the man who couldn't maintain his own body at elite standards, went back 53 times to win a car race, because it mattered to him, because it was his. 2023. David Nalbandian was 41 years old, long retired, living in Argentina. And his name came back into the news. His ex-girlfriend, model Araceli Tirado, filed a report with the police. Her brother had discovered something unusual behind a ventilation grate in the apartment where she lived. The apartment they had once shared, where she had stayed after the relationship ended. A hidden camera. Nalbandian admitted installing it. His defense was precise, lawyerly, and somehow entirely in character. He said he had never activated it, never watched anything. He had simply put it there. The case was initially closed for lack of evidence of transmission. Then it was reopened when Tirado's lawyers produced text messages and audio recordings, suggesting the intent had been there all along. Criminal and civil proceedings followed. The man who had read Federer's serve like it was written in giant letters. The man who had seen the entire court before his opponents could react. The man who controlled convocations and money and team tactics and press conferences and the angle of every backhand he ever hit, needed to see what was happening in a room he was no longer allowed to enter. He finished with 11 titles. 383 career victories, $11 million in prize money. The only Argentine man to reach at least the semifinals at all 4 Grand Slams, a Davis Cup record that will stand for decades, and the only player in the Open era to defeat Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic in the same tournament, in the same week. No Grand Slam title, never ranked #1. Never the clean ending the talent deserved. Here is what David Nalbandian teaches us. Some men are built without a ceiling. The same force that drives them to brilliant highs constitutionally refuses to recognize any flaw. The discipline that made lesser players world champions. He didn't need it to reach the top. And that right there was the problem, because he needed it to stay, and it wasn't there. Every man who has lived long enough knows this equation. You've watched it play out, in business, in family, in yourself. The qualities that make someone exceptional are inseparable from the ones that eventually bury them. Nalbandian was ungovernable. On the court, it was genius. The backhand that no one could replicate, the tactical vision that made the world's greatest players feel slow, the nerve to come back from 0-2 in sets against the most dominant player alive, pulled fresh from a fishing trip. Off the court, it was catastrophe. The teammates he deceived, the young player he bullied, the captain he humiliated, the line judge he hospitalized, the woman he surveilled. Some men don't have breaks, and the world calls it genius, right up until the moment it calls it something else entirely. David Nalbandian, the last ungovernable.